Hello, and thank you for participating in today's training, Understanding Human Trafficking. While we'd like to believe this crime is not occurring in our communities, be they big cities or rural areas, trafficked individuals can be found working in many industries, from agriculture to construction to hospitality and the service industry. Trafficking also occurs in commercial sex. Your job requires you to work with the public, and that provides you with an opportunity to make key observations. You may see something suspicious or overhear statements that indicate someone was subjected to physical force, was promised something that seems unbelievable, or is being threatened into work or commercial sex. This training will help you recognize the signs of sex and labor trafficking and understand what you can do to help while protecting yourself. We'll focus on the following learning objectives. We will define human trafficking. We will highlight groups that are particularly vulnerable to trafficking and discuss indicators of potential trafficking. We will offer some insight into how trafficking can occur. We will provide you with ways you can respond if you suspect trafficking is happening in your workplace or community. And finally, we will go over resources and supports that are available to trafficked individuals within New York State. Let's get started by examining how the law defines human trafficking. As we do so, we'll hear some essential terms that will help us understand what human trafficking is. Human trafficking is defined as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel an individual to work or engage in commercial sex. This is commonly referred to as labor trafficking or sex trafficking. A person can be compelled to engage in either or both labor and sex trafficking. What do we mean by commercial sex? Commercial sex is the exchange of a sex act for money or anything of value such as food or shelter. This can also be called prostitution or transactional sex. How someone is compelled to work or engage in commercial sex is called the means, that is, the method through which trafficking occurs. That means could be the use of force, fraud, or coercion. What do we mean by force? Force is the use of physical violence or threats of physical violence to make someone work or engage in commercial sex. These threats can be direct or implied. Implied or indirect threats are most effective when both the person making the threat and the recipient understand the meaning. For example, when a worker has previously observed their boss hit someone, the worker will likely understand that the threat, "If you don't show up for your shift, you know what will happen," means physical violence. The next means we'll examine is fraud. Fraud occurs when someone makes a promise they have no intention of fulfilling. Examples of fraud include statements like, "I'll help you get a visa or green card," to an immigrant with no intent of helping with the immigration process, or promising a future payment with no intention of paying the promised amount, or falsely promising to help with getting a job or career development. For the purposes of this training, we are using the term immigrant to describe anyone who has come to the United States from another country. An additional form of fraud is debt bondage. Debt bondage is when an individual is told they must work to pay off a debt, regardless of whether they owe money. An example of debt bondage could be an employer who loans an individual money and then charges compounding interest, creating a cycle of debt that's impossible to overcome. The final means our definition mentions is coercion. Coercion is a threat to cause someone serious harm in order to make them work or engage in commercial sex. That threat could be of physical harm or another type of harm, like revealing a secret. Examples of coercion include threats to call the police and falsely accuse someone of a crime, threats to call immigration authorities on an immigrant to have them deported, or a threat to call someone's family and tell them the individual has been working in commercial sex, or reveal their sexual orientation. Along with understanding what human trafficking is, it's important to also debunk myths that are associated with human trafficking.
Myth: human trafficking requires crossing a border.
Human trafficking is not based on geography and does not require crossing a border. The term trafficking can be confusing because it is often used in connection with illegal drug sales and smuggling. Smuggling is the act of moving people or goods across the border without official permission. The people being smuggled may have consented, but the bordering country has not officially authorized their entry. Human trafficking is the crime of making someone perform labor or commercial sex and can occur within the United States, across state lines, or within the same state.
Myth: if an individual is being paid, they are not a trafficked person.
An individual can be a survivor of human trafficking even if they are being paid. Unpaid wages, wage theft, or low wages are often involved in trafficking, but it is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel labor or commercial sex that defines human trafficking.
Myth: the individual was in a consensual relationship with the trafficker, so it cannot be trafficking.
Trafficking can involve complex relationships, and in sex trafficking, it is common for the trafficked person to have been involved in an intimate and/or a sexual relationship with the trafficker. The trafficker's actions can be a cycle of abuse that includes showing appreciation and acts of love, alternating with intimate partner violence and fraud or coercion. Additionally, if the individual is a minor, the law states their participation in commercial sex alone constitutes trafficking, regardless of whether force, fraud, or coercion was used to compel commercial sex. Now that we have defined human trafficking and debunked some common misconceptions about it, let's learn how to identify potential trafficking indicators. Sex trafficking can take place in any establishment, such as hotels, massage parlors, or from online ads or flyers that state the individual will come to residential locations. It can also be based out of truck stops, bars or clubs, or other environments not typically viewed as businesses. Labor trafficking has been found in construction, retail, food service, agriculture, salons, cleaning services, and in informal business environments like domestic work or in-home beauty services like hair braiding. Location-based indicators of sex and/or labor trafficking are high levels of control or security, the number and location of security cameras, workers not allowed to leave the work location unaccompanied, or employees living on the premises. If someone appears to be a subject of abuse, physically or verbally, this is a very strong indicator of sex and/or labor trafficking. Other signs to look for are if the person seems to be malnourished or sleep deprived, if the person has been coached on what to say or how to communicate with others, or if the individual does not have access to personal identification. When an individual does not have control over their earnings or is not paid for their work, this is also a strong indicator of labor exploitation or trafficking. Long work hours with minimal or no breaks and a lack of appropriate personal protective equipment are indicative of trafficking. If someone tells you they've been working every day and are not permitted to take time off to see a doctor or a dentist, that's a red flag. Another example would be someone who works in construction and does not have the appropriate footwear or safety equipment. A good question to ask yourself is, if my boss treated me that way, would it be out of the ordinary? Now that we have defined human trafficking, debunked some myths surrounding trafficking, and provided some potential trafficking indicators, let's look at some examples and ask ourselves, is this trafficking?
A boss threatens a worker to make them work.
Yes, this example meets the definition of labor trafficking due to the use of coercive threats to make an individual work.
A homeowner promises a runaway youth housing if the individual has sex with the homeowner's friends.
Yes, this would meet the definition of sex trafficking of a minor if sex is being traded for housing and the individual involved is a minor. The law considers transactional sex involving minors to be a crime, so legally, the use of force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven.
A family employing a woman who is in the U.S. on a work visa tells her she must hand over her passport for safekeeping.
The fact that the family has taken the woman's passport is highly suspect and is a potential indicator of trafficking. This act gives the family a high level of control over her, which they can use to compel her to work or keep working. If the family later uses this control to compel labor, this is trafficking.
A man coerces his partner into providing commercial sex, threatening her with harm if she does not comply.
This is a common scenario for sex trafficking. It is also common for the trafficker to take most, if not all, of the earnings. In the next section of this training, we will try to offer some insight into how trafficking can occur. It's important that we try to understand the power dynamics a trafficker may use to make the individual believe they must stay. A tool that can help us understand how traffickers can manipulate an individual is the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel was originally developed to explain the behaviors and actions used to keep someone in an abusive, intimate partner violence situation. There is a strong correlation between the power dynamics in intimate partner violence and those used by traffickers to compel labor or commercial sex. Isolation is used to create a distance from others, which can create a dependency on the trafficker. This then increases the trafficker's power over an individual. Traffickers will say, "I'm the only one who can help you," or "You're nothing without me," and "No one will listen to you." By isolating the individual from friends or family, the trafficker separates them from their support group, which might otherwise identify the trafficker's behavior as abusive. Traffickers may also use emotional abuse in the form of humiliation to try and decrease the individual's self-worth. They may try to shift blame by saying, "You made me do it." Physical abuse may also be used, including limiting access to food or sleep. Sometimes, a person who is very tired or hungry may not be able to make decisions or think past the current crisis to see a pattern of abusive behavior. In extreme cases, a trafficker may provide a person with drugs as a stimulant and to create a positive mood, which can then lead to the trafficker using access to drugs as an additional method of control. As with intimate partner violence, traffickers can cycle between tactics to establish power and control. Sometimes a trafficker may utilize physical or emotional abuse to retain control, such as using coercive threats and physical violence. But at other times, a trafficker may profess love and concern, such as saying, "I need you, you're my best earner." Both tactics have the aim of reinforcing the trafficker's power and control, manipulating the individual into labor or sex for the trafficker's financial benefit. Inconsistent rewards, like professing love and concern at irregular intervals, are called intermittent reinforcement in psychology, and have been shown to be highly effective in motivating people to repeat the action, because the individual never knows when they are going to receive a compliment, a positive reward, or some form of harm. It's important to recognize that the fear a trafficked person has of the consequences of leaving a trafficking situation is very real, and that the trafficked person has the most knowledge of how the perpetrator will react. Human trafficking can affect anyone, But there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to being trafficked than others. Trafficking often involves domination based on gender, race, class, lack of immigration status, or other perceived superiority. Individuals that are subjected to repeated discrimination, lack valid immigration status, are experiencing poverty, have a history of abuse, or are of a young age are more vulnerable to human trafficking. Discrimination occurs when a person is treated unfairly based on gender, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, race or ethnicity, national origin, disability, or other societal factors. The origins of discrimination are primarily learned culturally as a subconscious belief system that assigns superiority to one's own group and inferiority to another. It can require a lot of effort to unlearn. For example, social norms for gender roles that create expectations of women being supportive, passive, and refraining from aggressive behavior can lead to deference to a male partner and play a part in trafficking, especially at the recruitment or grooming stage. Men may also be socialized into believing that being aggressive or exhibiting domineering behavior is their natural role. Let's look at an example of a transgender individual who is continuously denied employment because of their gender identity or expression. As a result of employment discrimination, this person may now believe they must seek employment outside of the formal sector, which can leave them vulnerable to human trafficking. Individuals who experience discrimination on the basis of more than one perceived characteristic, such as women of color, can be increasingly vulnerable.
Demographics from U.S. Department of Justice trafficking prosecutions from 2011 illustrate the disproportionate racial makeup of trafficked persons. While the U.S. population was 12.3% Black, 40.4% of sex-trafficked individuals were Black. That is 3 times their representation in the general population. The representation of Hispanic labor-trafficked individuals was also 3 times higher than the 17.1% makeup of the general population. The U.S. population was 5% Asian. However, Asian individuals made up 14.8% of labor-trafficked persons. On the other end of the spectrum, the U.S. population was 62.4% white, while only 25.6% of sex-trafficked persons were white and 1.6% of labor-trafficked individuals were white. It is important to note these statistics demonstrate the racial makeup of individuals whose traffickers were prosecuted in federal criminal cases in 2011 and does not represent all trafficking, as not all cases are identified or prosecuted.
Individuals without legal immigration status may be more vulnerable to labor exploitation or even trafficking. New York is home to Ellis Island and has a long history of immigrant arrivals. From the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, when garment workers organized in the wake of public horror over the death of more than 100 mostly immigrant women to create the first labor laws of the United States, immigrant workers have been an integral part of the American economy. Today, we have improved labor protections, but Know Your Rights trainings are still critical to combat labor law violations, such as failure to pay minimum wage, overtime, or for all hours worked. And when labor exploitation involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion, it crosses the line into the criminal act of trafficking. Traffickers can exploit an immigrant's unfamiliarity with the language, culture, or lack of an established community and access to resources. Immigrants may arrive without a path to lawful immigration status or on a visa that expires. Their lack of immigration status or expired immigration status can make them more vulnerable to threats by employers to call immigration and have them deported, or false promises of assisting with obtaining lawful immigration status or documentation, such as a green card. Individuals who are experiencing poverty are also at an increased risk of trafficking, and a lack of stable housing is a key vulnerability. If someone does not have financial resources or support, they are more vulnerable to exploitation. Individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders that begin in early childhood and affect learning, behavior, and social and physical development may have intellectual and developmental disabilities that make them more vulnerable to trafficking. Studies have found that minors with intellectual or developmental disabilities were more likely to also exhibit risk factors like running away, risky internet behavior, and difficulty discerning between a potential romantic partner and a trafficker, placing this population at higher risk for trafficking. Being exposed to violence in childhood can cause people to either internalize and self-blame or externalize and act out towards others, verbally or physically. Now that we have identified vulnerable populations, let's talk about who may be a perpetrator. There is no standard profile of a trafficker. It could be anyone who is willing to use their power to compel someone into commercial sex or labor. Traffickers have included respected members of the community, including small business owners, farmers, diplomats, clergy, and even law enforcement. The commonality is that they are financially or otherwise benefiting from exploiting the trafficked person for commercial sex or labor. Some characteristics to look for may include exhibiting a sense of superiority, a need to have power and control over others, or a willingness to act in ways outside the law and social norms, such as using force, lies, or threats. In this training, we are focusing on identifying trafficked persons and helping them to access appropriate services. If you observe someone acting in a way that indicates they may be a perpetrator of trafficking, they may be dangerous and should not be approached. Investigating human trafficking is the role of law enforcement, and when untrained individuals attempt to rescue persons who are potentially being trafficked, they may put themselves and the trafficked person at risk of harm. However, if there is an imminent danger to yourself or others, call 911. At this point in the training, we are going to talk about what to do if you think you have recognized that an individual is being trafficked. In responding to potential trafficking, we want to highlight both criminal justice and public health responses. In the criminal justice framework, we look at an individual who is the perpetrator of a crime, the trafficker, and the person who is the victim of the crime, with the goal to prosecute the perpetrator of the crime and provide services for the trafficked person. You may have noticed that we have generally not referred to trafficked individuals as victims during this training, because many people who have been trafficked reported that they find the word victim to be a negative label that essentializes all of them into one aspect of their lives. A second approach, called a public health approach, looks at what can be done to prevent trafficking from occurring. The public health approach to human trafficking takes a step back and looks at the whole population, identifying who is more likely to be vulnerable to trafficking and why, to identify systemic trends and what support and care interventions can be taken to decrease risk factors and increase protective factors. The techniques we will discuss are often called culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered. Culturally responsive means we understand that an individual from a different background may have their own customs, perspectives, and life experiences that we should treat with respect. Trauma is often thought of as a physical injury, as in the trauma ward of a hospital. In this context of a trauma-informed approach, we are describing an injury to the person's mental and emotional health rather than a physical injury. In the same way that a physical injury that is untreated can continue to cause pain and suffering, trauma can continue to cause harm. Although the effects of trauma may not be physically visible, they can continue to cause harm to mental health and wellness. Trauma-informed means that when you are interacting with a person, you are doing so with the understanding that they have been injured, and their responses to stimuli are likely to be influenced by this injury. Examples of this include an individual describing something horrific with a flat expression, which might lead you to believe this is not a true story, since your personal expectation is for them to have an emotional reaction. It could also be someone who cries over what might seem to you to be a minor incident. Survivor-centered means we don't try to pressure a trafficked person to act in the way we believe is best for them. Instead, we defer to their knowledge of themselves and their experiences to make their own decisions. Our role is to provide support and accurate information to empower them to have good choices. The most common means of identifying a trafficked person is through self-disclosure by that person. They've decided to trust someone and tell them what has been happening. It is critical not to betray that trust and pressure the trafficked person into leaving a trafficking situation if they are not ready. Like in intimate partner violence, the decision to leave a trafficking situation often results in escalation, as the trafficker can seek to re-establish their power through increased violence. Your role is to help the trafficked person connect to a service provider who will work with them to identify and implement a safety plan. We'll use a scenario to help you picture the scene and how you should respond.
A woman walks into your place of business and asks to use the restroom. She looks like she has bruises on her upper arm from someone grabbing her, and she is combative and aggressive. What do you do?
First, investigating human trafficking is the role of law enforcement. When untrained individuals attempt to rescue persons who are potentially being trafficked, they may put themselves and the trafficked person at risk of harm. If there is an imminent danger to yourself or others, call 911. If it is safe to interact with the person, here are some suggestions. First, it's important that you don't make promises you don't know if you can keep, like saying, "I promise you'll be safe." This is presenting yourself in the active role of savior and the individual as the passive recipient, rather than communicating to the individual that they are empowered and have choices. You should listen, be honest, treat them with respect, and be empathetic. Their trafficker is likely making false promises, lying and manipulating to exploit them for labor or financial gain. They may have been told no one will believe them or that the situation is their own fault. Your goal is to convey the opposite. Take cues from them. Social workers will often use the phrase, "meet them where they're at." It takes courage to open up about trafficking to someone. If they do not want to discuss what is happening to them, or they are not ready to seek help, you must respect their choices. For example, affirm that the situation sounds really hard and let the person know that they have choices and that there are resources available. You can communicate messages of hope and validate the person's right to make their own decisions. Hope is a very powerful emotion. Lack of hope can keep someone in an abusive situation, whether that is with a partner or an employer. Helping them find hope can be the first step in getting out of a trafficking situation. Appropriate messages include, "Help is available. You have rights. You are not alone and not to blame. And you are able to receive services regardless of your immigration status in the United States."
Resources are available to trafficked individuals. If a person indicates they are interested in resources or approaches you asking for help, you can refer them to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The hotline is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and can be reached by calling 1-888-373-7888 or by texting Be Free 233-733. This federally funded hotline can connect a trafficked individual to law enforcement and service providers. It is best to encourage the individual to contact the hotline themselves, as they may be asked for information that can only be provided by the affected individual. If you suspect your employer or someone else of engaging in human trafficking, you can also call the National Anti-Human Trafficking Hotline and report an anonymous tip.
New York State provides funding through the Response to Human Trafficking program to nonprofit service providers throughout the state. Many trafficking survivors have left their homes and do not have access to resources. Service providers can help with emergency needs, such as food and shelter, medical treatment, or mental health counseling, as well as longer-term needs, such as case management or legal assistance. These services are available regardless of a person's immigration status.
The list of New York State Response to Human Trafficking Program regional service providers can be found by going to the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance's Human Trafficking webpage and clicking on New York State Regional Service Provider. There are also protections in place for violations of labor rights. The New York State Department of Labor can investigate unpaid wages, failure to pay minimum wage, illegal appropriation of tips by employers, and other wage violations. The Department of Labor can also conduct site visits where there is suspected trafficking.
This concludes the New York State Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking's Understanding Human Trafficking training. Thank you for your attention, and we hope you use what you have learned today to help identify human trafficking, who may be vulnerable to possible trafficking, and what to do if you are asked to help. Help is available.